You're listening to the Bulldog Hour, getting you inside the Wilson football program with weekly game previews, recaps, highlights, and interviews. Now, here are your hosts, Joe Mays and Justin Raffoff.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Bulldog Hour. I'm one of your hosts, Joe Mays, and sitting here with me is my co-host, Justin Raffoff.
Yeah, it's great to be here. It's been a little bit since we've done a Bulldog Hour show, but it's great to be here, and what a topic tonight, right?
Yeah, we've got quite the topic here. We're about 2 months removed from our latest show, which happened at the end of February. End of February. We were here with Spotlight on Burke Sports and Jim Berkman, and we talked a little bit of Wilson football, but a lot about other scholastic sports around the county. So again, we thank Jim for joining us that day. And we are not alone for this show. The off-season shows are a lot of fun. They're a little bit more laid back, although the topic for tonight, like Justin talked about, I don't know, it could get it's up for a lively debate, as we've already been hearing on socials. And to me specifically, to my face and through text, I've been hearing a lot of people say, I'm really excited for that show, but it's a tough task to cover. So Justin and I couldn't do this alone. So we brought in two ringers here for us. One, a returning guy. You're familiar because this topic, actually, this top five started with Paul and I last summer. So Paul Roberts is back, Burke Sports Report. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
We Paul and I did quarterbacks last, I think it was June.
Which I had a lot more difficult time with this list than that one. The top quarterbacks I thought were pretty cut and dry for the most part. This was harder for me to put together.
Yeah, we said at the time, man, if we expand this and do more, it could get dicey because everyone's going to want you to do running backs next, and that list is going to be tough. Well, here we are, ready to discuss it, but we can't do it just the three of us, so we brought in another individual, someone that the Wilson fans should be familiar with, both as a player in the 90s and a current defensive backs coach, Jami Sands.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Should be an interesting dialogue tonight.
Yes, and you have a great perspective for us because you're one of the guys up for debate tonight. I think we're going to hear your name a little bit.
Well, let's just say any running back that's started at Wilson over the years, you have to be a pretty special athlete to even be a starter. So, there's a lot of people that could be talked about tonight for sure.
Yeah, and this is the cream of the crop discussion, but I do want to put a few things out there before anyone gets upset and angry, as people want to do on the internet. We're not doing this to diminish anyone's accomplishments. This is all for fun. The four of us are certainly going to have fun. I hope everyone watching out there or listening after the fact are enjoying this. And if you yourself or a friend or family member is not mentioned in this debate, I'm sorry that they didn't come up, but trust me, everyone that has played at Wilson is important, and we can only talk about so many people. I mean, I put, I think, 12 or 13 on the visual, and the number of people that I left off that I had on my list, I just only had so much space. So we're not going to talk any negatives tonight. We're not going to get into, if this person didn't get injured, or this is not a negative thing. The Bulldog Hour is always a positive thing. We're going to talk about the incredible accomplishments of these athletes and the people that helped them get there, from the coaching staff, and to, yes, in this topic, the offensive lines, because that was the other thing that people brought up. I can't talk about the running backs without the offensive line. We're aware of that. As a former offensive lineman, I'm very aware of that. But it's very tough to single out offensive linemen just because the research involved with that would be incredible. It would take a tough task. Thankfully, the Wilson program through years with Rich Romick and now Coach Doms has done an amazing job accumulating these stats and keeping them available for people like us to use when we get into discussion. And then thankfully, there are a lot of game film out there now that you can look back on the past. I've been posting some of those over the last few years. But again, this is all for fun. We're looking forward to it. We've been working on it for about 6 weeks to come up with these lists. I said, as soon as I asked Paul to come on and told him this was the topic, I think he had a huge exhale and was just like, this is going to be a task. Do you have the Wilson stats book? So
that's funny because that's immediately what I said to you. I was like, I'm going to need to look at the stats book.
Yeah. So I'll quickly run through our sponsors. The thank you to May's Sandwich Shop and Bill May's my dad, to Mike Drago and Mike Drago Sports, Al Wicks at CNS Supply, and our individual and family sponsors, the Hop family, Andy Herr, Marty Palm, and our 3 anonymous donors. There's multiple ways you can support us. You've heard the deal by now. Check us out at bulldoghour.com, or you can hit me up and we can get that taken care of for you. Last announcement thing here is our next live show will be at the end of June, Sunday the 26th. We don't need to go over the schedule tonight because there's a lot more for us to talk about. So I don't want to hold up anymore, but would anyone like to have an opening discussion, or should we dive right into Paul's list? Because we're going to throw Paul to the fire right away.
Do we want to talk about the Spring Township Reds Little League team that Jamie and I played on that my dad coached? That was a juggernaut way back when.
Are there any other big names on that
Stevie
team?
Dallas was on that team. Brian Stahl was on that team.
Luke Riffle.
Yeah, I mean that's good. Now I don't know, but yeah. I just wanted a quick shout out there. Spring Township Reds.
Scotty Rohrbach.
Scotty Rohrbach.
To tie into this, and
Pete
I brought
Klum.
this up before the show, like, I've lived here over 2 decades, and I'm by far the newest to Berks County / Wilson in this discussion.
You're an outsider.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, I'm like, on the way over, the thought that came to mind, I was like, there's nothing more like Wilson tradition or Berks County than like 22 years, not even close to the newest one, or the not being the newest one on this panel tonight.
I think the only thing I'll say is Paul, Justin, and I were on the same page. We were not out of left field. No one had picks on here that no one thought of. We were all pretty consistent when it came to our top 5s. They are all different. There is a lot of overlap, however. I mentioned this when I created it and posted it, the running backs on the image. If you're looking at your screen or watching this, left to right goes from Mike Ritz, Vito Ninfo, Brian Mccarty, Jeff Nadrowski, Jami Sands, Alex Austin, Pete Gilmore, Chaz Logan, Jake Stopper, Rodney Gillen, Shane Dantzler, Iggy Renoso, and most recently Jaden Jones. So those are the ones that I was able to pull out and put on this image. There was, like I said, double that came into consideration for all of us sitting here tonight. Oh, and one last thing I want to mention, because you guys brought this up walking in, not about the show, just talking about it because so many people have been discussing this. To me, fullbacks are a separate category. So you're not going to hear me mention, I think any of us knowing the list, Leroy Schonauer. There's been, to me, he was always a fullback by heart. And you can eviscerate me in the comments if you want. If the, single back, was he just a single back? Was he not, we can get into discussions of football another time. I'm talking specifically the guy lined up in the I formation, the second guy, not the lead blocker. We're not talking about lead blockers, who I know like to get those dives and those traps, and they've done great things. And Leroy is obviously the one that comes first to mind. But I know there was already another name thrown out when you guys got here this evening.
I think it was Brent Grace. Walber was given a lot of love too.
Yeah. So those guys didn't come up in this discussion because I wasn't considering fullbacks. I was specifically talking the running backs. So again, we'll put that out there before anyone says we need to comment on so and so. Might have been the fullback. So we're gonna just put that out there to begin with. But anything else before we want to dive in here? So then I'm gonna put up Paul real quickly. If you just want to touch on maybe the way you dove into this and how you formulated your list, like what was important to you, or if there are guys off the top that you immediately like, well, they have to be on there. I just want to put up some of the stats for the people to see as we go.
Yeah, and as Joe mentioned right at the top, all of these players are great. So I think the word great in general in our society is overused vastly. Here it's appropriate. So if someone's honorable mention, still a great football player. Okay, if someone's number 5 as opposed to you think they should be number 1 or 2, they're all still great football players. So like Joe was mentioning, we're not discrediting anyone. Sometimes these lists go that way. Doing talk radio for over 20 years, I can tell you that's usually how it goes. People will argue, well, this guy should have been one. It doesn't mean that we're diminishing their accomplishments. I mean, all these players are superstars. These are, Hall of Fame players, legends, not just at Wilson, but in the county. But I started with Mike Ritz for the simple reason that when I kind of look at the foundation of Wilson football, and for the younger kids and the high school players who are hopefully watching now, believe it or not, there were some lean years. I know it doesn't happen nowadays, but in 1962 and 63, they won 1 game each of those seasons. John Gursky arrives from Cole Township, God's country, up north in 64, and then everything started to change. And Mike Ritz, I think, was just the perfect running back for what John Gursky wanted to do. I mean, John Gursky is this massive man who wanted to play power football. And, we've all heard the stories about their practices that went well into the evening and just running the same things over and over and over. But they wanted to dominate at the line of scrimmage. Well, how about having a 210-pound running back to incorporate into that type of rock'em sock'em robot philosophy? And that was Mike Ritz. I mean, even nowadays, how many 210-pound running backs do we see in high school football? As kids have gotten huge, and we see linemen now that are 280, 300 pounds, you still don't see many. There are some. You don't see many 210-pound running backs. Now let's go back 55 years.
Almost non-existent.
So if you guys remember when the Reading Phillies had their series of games out at this stadium, the Gridiron Classic, I did a radio show where I brought in a lot of old coaches who played there. Coach Doms was one, but I probably had 10 guests on this one show for an hour or two. It was great. It was a lot of fun. But we talked about playing there and some of those old teams. And these guys who went up against Mike Ritz, they said it was like tackling an offensive lineman. And in those days, he was bigger than most of the offensive linemen. So just how rare his physical attributes were for that time and day, that was one thing that I think separated Mike Ritz, which I put him at number 1. His stats aren't quite the same as some of the others, but it was kind of how this program got built.
Just to piggyback that, he actually had the record for highest average yards per carry.
Oh, it's funny you mentioned that. I literally have that up
until 95, right?
I have the season yards per carry up there right now, and Mike Ritz is there tied for 10th.
Yeah,
that's 7.2. But yeah, hold on, let me pull up the career yards per carry. That was my second one. I'm pulling it back up. Here we are. Mike Ritz is down to 7th on that as well, but it took a long time to knock him off because all the guys listed on there, I believe the oldest guy listed in front of Mike Ritz is Jami Sands. So,
well, the only reason I find it interesting is my father graduated from Wilson High School in '68, so he went to school with Mike.
That was the same, yep, right there. Yards per carry career, you have Gillen and Sands tied at the top. Austin, Gilmore, Renoso, Dantzler, and then you get to Ritz and Jaden Jones is tied with him at 7th.
Right, but you look at that list and you have a couple guys, I think, from those early 90s-ish teams, but then everyone else is, or not everyone, but a lot of those guys are in the last 20, 25 years, whereas you have to add another 30 years onto that to get back. Like, just a player that was ahead of his time.
Yeah. Yep.
Right.
And I'm pretty sure they weren't running the spread when Ritz was running it.
No, they knew what was coming.
Right. That was one thing that was interesting to me, how many modern running backs are up there, but it's because they're spreading out. The defense is being spread out. It allows these athletic backs to get in the open field and make a name for themselves. But Mike Ritz and those guys in the 60s and 70s and into the early 80s too. That was 3 yards in a cloud of dust, right?
Exactly.
It was ground and pound, and they knew it was coming. I know I hear people talk about it all the time. It was like 62 dive,
62 drive,
62 drive.
Yeah.
Just reminisce because there was there's like 6 plays.
Yeah, right? It's like the old Tecmo football. It
always feels
you had like 4 plays in the original Tecmo.
Yeah, it feels like Mike Ritz was a cheat code. Before video games became a thing.
He was the Bo Jackson.
Right? Yeah, he was, and Gursky's arrival, and then when Ritz came along, and Ritz played 2 years for Wilson, fall of 66 and 67, I believe, and 67 was the first 10-0 undefeated teams, one of the best teams in Wilson history.
He was also the first Big 33 pick.
Yes,
Wilson, and that's something I look because that's a special honor. I mean, all state is certainly outstanding too, but Big 33, that's pretty rare. And Joe, you were asking like what we looked at. Yards per carry, which you mentioned, is a big one to me because if you just look at total yards, certain guys may have played 3 years, 2 years, maybe just 1 year. Mm-hmm. So the overall yardage numbers could really vary, but yards per carry is just based on your attempts.
And yards per carry here, I don't know that the stats book has a minimum for that because obviously the less carries, the more opportunities to have a big one here. But all the guys listed had hundreds of carries. This isn't a guy who just carried it 20 times and each time he went 10 or 12 yards. These are guys that were running backs running between the tackles or off tackle, and they were earning it. The carries thing came up a lot. And like with myself talking about it, it was nice to have the per carry averages in that stat book. What Rich did, and what Coach Doms has continued is just spectacular for a stats and history guy like me. Having those books every year, and I'm going through Doc Moyer's scrapbooks, and he has Mr. Romich's stats from each season, and it's great to see it change. And I'd like to chronicle it just because there's some guys that have been knocked off the current book that I can add back in. So it's really cool to see all that history. But you brought up number of games played, and that could be because maybe you got on the scene as a junior or a senior. Well, Mike Ritz only moved, he was able to play 2 years. Imagine what if he would have had an extra year as a sophomore. Or we have a guy like Gilmore who was on the varsity for 4 years. But that's why I think the per carry, those type of averages are very important. But what was awesome to see is it was the same guys, whether the career total yardage or the per carry. It was almost the entire group. There was this group of about 12 to 15 guys, 15 to 20 guys that just their names kept popping up for everything. I texted Justin about this as I was like, why am I anxious and nervous about this discussion? Why is it such a big thing? But I texted him, I'm like, man, I really think some people are going to have a tough time with this. And do you think we should do pre-playoff era and post-playoff era? Because those are extra games that people got to play.
I'm like, nope, let's just rip this Band-Aid off.
Yeah.
But I think like being able to use the per carry information was really important.
Right. So, and I kind of viewed that also as like, yes, you do add some other games in there, but at the same time, like you might get one that you might breeze through in a playoff year, like especially some of those years where they're like 16 teams, in playoffs. But like anymore, like you might get one, but after that, you're playing some really tough teams.
Yeah, so usually the yards per carry comes down.
Right, if you have a huge game in the playoffs, like okay, we'll give it to you.
Yeah.
All right, Paul. So you can't see this, so I'll clue you in. I posted your top 5 completely for everyone to see. You already touched on Mike Ritz, who was your number 1. He was a senior in the fall of 1967. So why don't we go to your number 2? Talk to us about Alex Austin.
Yeah, so I have Alex Austin second. And what's interesting about Alex, and we're just focusing on running back, but when he made the Big 33 team, it was as a defensive back, technically. He had 15 career interceptions, which in high school football is like unreal. I often think that Alex might have been the most physically gifted. I would certainly put Jami up there as well, in that I think like you could ask them to do any sport or activity and they would just be like awesome, just like roll out of bed and be really, really good. When you look at like God-given tools, I think of Alex Austin right away. I mean, he was the total package. I mean, I don't know, it's hard to find a weakness there. Obviously, the game against McCaskey, the 331, that's still the Wilson record, correct, for a single game?
Single game, I believe so. Justin has the stats book
there.
Actually, I think I had that on a slide now that I think about it.
But 331.
Yes, most rushing yards in a game. Alex Austin, 331 versus McCaskey in 97. Pete Gilmore got close a few years later against Manheim Central.
Yeah, and before that, Jeff Nadrowski went over 300 yards against Mifflin, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But Alex was just he was a pure talent. Obviously, things didn't work out at the D1 level, but the fact that major D1 teams are looking at you, that huge. Power conference teams are coming in to look at you, I mean, that tells you all you need to know about Alex Austin. We mentioned yards per carry. He was just shy of 8 for his career. I don't know where everybody else has people, but Austin has to be in the top 5 for everybody.
You said Alex Austin, third in yards per carry for his career at 7.8, which is incredible number. Justin, you have it up right there. How many carries did Alex have?
Career carries, let's see, 418.
He's not high up on the list. He's actually down at 8 or 9.
He's an 8th.
Absolutely stellar talent in Alex Austin. And let's see if I can pull your top 5 back up. So Alex was your number 2. Your number 3, though, is Rodney Gillen.
Right. So the analytics folks out there will love Rodney Gillen. I mean, they would, if you're just going on numbers, the computer geeks, they'll probably put him number 1 because yards per carry tied for first with the man to my left, and yards, total rushing yards, he's number 1. The 2010 season, I mean, we know the type of schedule Wilson plays. It's not what I like to call a Fat Albert schedule that has a lot of cupcakes.
Hey.
That right there will be the best part of the show. But in 2010, Rodney Gillen averaged 10 yards a carry. So you give him the ball and you just got a first down. I mean, that for a whole season, that's incredible. And we often hear speed kills. Rodney could fly. I mean, he was a burner. And that, I think, what separated him. Ended up going out to Cal, I believe, in the PSAC West and was a defensive back. But for people who don't follow Division II football, the teams out west get a lot more scholarship money, and they tend to get a lot of D1 kids who, for whatever reason, things happen, and then they end up transferring. So it's really good football, but that's where Rodney went. But, I mean, you're first overall in rushing yards, and you're tied for first in yards per carry. I put him third. I'm sure others could argue maybe he should be higher.
We'll see. We'll see. I don't want to jump on there too much, but Gillen, immediately when this conversation comes up, I say everyone formulates, who do you picture? If you're asked that question, you've been following Wilson football for that long, you mentioned Mike Ritz, that jumped in my head. Rodney Gillen was right there because I was just thinking back, and this was right when I moved back to the area and was getting involved with Wilson football again. I just would hear, in the newspaper, on the radio, talking to friends and family. It was just, did you see, what Justin has the book. I don't know if he can pull it up quickly, but he rushed for over 100 yards in 12 straight games or something ridiculous like that.
Some of the things that are popping out from the guys that you've mentioned already, like Alex Austin in the career or individual game offensive records, he scored 24 points in a quarter once. Like that's a record. And you just see some of these things, like the most yards gained was 331 against McCaskey.
We talked
just
that.
Just absolutely absurd seeing some of these guys pop up.
I mean, and keep in mind, when these guys are playing, how good they are, their defensive coordinators for the other teams are designing to stop them.
Right.
And they're still
Right.
putting up these kinds of numbers.
And you mentioned the career interceptions. He had 10 interceptions in a season.
For Alex Austin, yeah.
That's absurd.
Yeah.
10 in one season.
Yeah. I don't even know if Stevie Mitchell ever had 24 points in a quarter.
Now we're going to get all more kinds of like comments.
All right, Paul, we're getting close to the end of your top 5. So let's go to your number 4. And for this guy, I actually have a highlight reel. So
Oh, nice.
I have his recruiting tape. So we're going to play that while you talk about it. Tell us about Pete Gilmore.
Well, he was a big 33 pick at running back. And anytime I hear Pete's name, I automatically go back to 1999. So I graduated Syracuse in 99 and started in radio just a month after that. So that was my first year as a professional of covering high school football around here. And people know I get to games really early to talk to the coaches and things like that. And the parking lot was mobbed already hours before the game when they played Mannheim Central, who had Jeff Smoker and was top 25 in the country by USA Today going into that game. 8,800 is what the crowd was estimated at. It's often referred to as the most ever for a Wilson game. Who knows if that's, some of those Wilson Reading games when Henny and Bryant were there, those were also huge crowds. But almost 9,000 people were at that game. And it was one of the best individual performances I've seen in my life in high school football, where Pete ran for 303 yards. I think he had 82 carries. I might have missed one or two in there against Mannheim Central, but Wilson kind of played power football. And, obviously Smoker, Jeff Smoker and Chad Henny were the two best pocket passers I've ever seen in high school football. And that's all the district games, state games. Things didn't work out for Jeff when he went to college. But if you saw him in high school, he was the real deal. But Wilson ended up winning that game. It was 35-29. But I always think about that game and Pete for what he did on that night. And that season, they won a district championship. He had over 1,800 yards just that year in that 1999 season. He was about 7.5 per carry for his career. And Pete also had the power to his game. Jamie mentioned that when we got here tonight about if you're looking for combinations of different backs, Pete would be a good mix. Third in career rushing yards, just over 3,500. Again, I have him 4. If people have him higher, I certainly would not argue.
I think the thing that jumped out to me about Pete, well, first the 97 Wilson team had Austin and Gilmore in the same backfield, and Frank Wilson, I believe, too, on the 97 team. Or was he 90? Was he a senior in 96? I'm sorry, I'm
Which
getting
one?
Frank.
Frank was a sophomore in 95.
Okay, so he would have been on the 97 team. So that
we're a freshman. Maybe we had him up as a freshman.
Okay, well,
yeah.
The 3 of them, though, in 97 were on the same team. That's one heck of a backfield. But watching this tape and doing research for this show, we talked about already Alex Austin and how just athletic specimen, amazing at everything, offense, defense. The same thing for Pete watching the tape. The one highlight in this video, he levels a guy from his cornerback spot.
I think that one went through already.
It went through already. It's early.
Gosh.
I could feel the hit, 20 some years later. That's how hard he hit the guy. But also the return game. He had such an incredible component in the return game. But again, best Wilson running backs. What do you think of? Pete Gilmore's one that immediately comes to mind. And I'm very biased, and I have thrown this out there on Bulldog Hour and anyone I've ever talked about Wilson football. Those 90 teams up until I became a player on the team, and that was 2000s. But those 90s, like basically 1991 through 99, the big guys that you always hear announced over the loudspeaker system, those are always the names that are going to pop into my mind. So that's Jeff Nadrowski, Jami Sands, Alex Austin, Pete Gilmore. Like those are the 4 running backs. I just remember hearing their names as I'm at the stadium on Friday nights over and over and over. So those are always the names that come up. And Pete being the one right before I became a high school Wilson football player, it's just incredible what he was able to do. And I remember, I mentioned Rodney Gillen was at the beginning of me coming back to the area and starting to get involved with Wilson football. Rodney was chasing Pete's records, so it came full circle. 10 years later, seeing Rodney push and finally get past Pete for a couple of these records. So
just a quick side note, like Huddle is a great tool that has changed the way players get seen and teams can study other teams and everything. However, watching a highlight tape that doesn't pause every play to like highlight which player I'm supposed to be watching.
There's a couple of them in here.
It's kind of refreshing.
Yeah.
This highlight video is actually before his senior year, so all the 99 stuff we touched on isn't even on this tape.
Really?
But the 98 Manheim Central game, which no one wants us to bring up ever, is on there, and it's the first play because he returns a kick for a touchdown in that game in the rain down in Manheim, and that's the tuck rule before the tuck rule, where Smoker said, I definitely fumbled that ball. But we're not going to get off on that tangent.
Thought you weren't going to bring it up.
We're not going to talk about it at all. No. So Paul, that just leaves your number 5 here. And
and if we ever do a tight end list, which would be a great list too, Pete's brother John would certainly.
I would think he would be mentioned. Yeah.
He'll be on that Mount Rushmore. Number 5 was tricky for me, and this player, I think, will get a lot of conversation because of how he was used. I put Brian Mccarty there. Now, it's interesting because he's not top 10 in career rushing yards. He had over 1,800, and 1,400 of those came when he was a junior in '89, which, of course, is the Kerry Collins team that got to the state championship game and came up just a little bit short. But in that '89 season, McCarty also had over 800 receiving yards. So we're talking about 2,200 plus combined yards. I mean, he could do everything there. I will also, full disclosure, I did email Coach Doms and ask for his list just to get some perspective. And he had Brian in his top 5. So that did carry weight with me, just because I have so much respect for Coach Doms.
I did consider doing that, but I wanted to go in with a fresh slate altogether because I didn't want someone else's opinion to sway me too much. But I strongly considered reaching out to Coach Doms and Coach Slemmer to say, who would be your top 5?
Yeah.
But then I also didn't want to get in the position where someone asked me, and I don't want to out them to be like, well, here's their 5, and this is why they ranked them here. I'm going to avoid that.
So I'm not going to tell you Coach Doms' 5.
You can tell me off air, though.
Yeah, I have. But I would just say this. He did have Brian McCarty in his top 5. Maybe it's the reporter in me. I like asking a lot of questions. So, and if you want a resource, Coach Doms is a pretty good guy to go to. But then Jeff Nadrowski in 90 was the leading rusher. McCarty was not. So if you're just going to look at career rushing yards, he's probably not in your top 5. But I factored in, the versatility that he had to be able to catch the football, being part of, the only team to get to the state championship game. And I don't know, Joe, if you want me to go through my honorable mention.
Oh, we're going to do that next.
Okay. Yeah. Because there are guys there that I certainly could have put at 5. This was really close. I'll say this. My top 4, I have no doubts I would not change. And despite what anyone wants to argue with me, I would not change my top 4. The 5th spot there, to me, that's up in the air a little bit.
Yeah, I feel like that's sort of how I went about it too. There's a couple, but there's ones that I was like, definitely feel this way. But then I felt bad about not having some of these other guys.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can see that's kind of how we handled the quarterback. We felt like there was like a definite top, at least 3, if not 4,
right,
that were guaranteed. And then that 5th spot, there was about like 10 people we considered for that last
because
spot.
with Carey, Chad, Shane, and Chris Adams, to me that was a pretty.
And then we talked about
4.
Sapola, and we talked about
Zweizig.
Palm, we talked about Zweizig. Yeah, we talked about all these.
But
numbers.
I was very comfortable with the first 4 there.
Yeah. So, well, why don't we do that then? Why don't we talk about we each did a next 4 or a just missed, and they're not ranked. They're in no particular order. But I'll throw yours up here, Paul. So why don't you dive into your 4 that just missed the cut on your list?
Well, I had Iggy Renoso, who was right there. I mean, it looked like he was chiseled out of stone. I mean, the guy, I don't know what his body fat was, but good luck trying to pinch an inch on Iggy Renoso. I mean, he was just looked like he was built out of brick. I mean, it was unbelievable how strong he was. And me covering the whole county, I saw him as a freshman at Hamburg, and it's like, whoa. Like, what do we have here? And then his sophomore year, he was over 1,000 yards as a 10th grader at Hamburg. So that's another tricky thing when you want to rank Wilson running backs. Mm-hmm. Iggy had over 1,500 rushing yards at Hamburg.
Right.
And then at Wilson, he was over 3,200.
Yeah, I mean, if you take the 1,500 at Hamburg and move it over, he's at 47, which is 1,100 more than Gillen, who's number 1.
Exactly. So that, it depends how you want to view what he did at Hamburg. But at Wilson, he was 2-time All-State selection. I think people forget this. He led the team in catches. Mm-hmm. In as big and strong as he was, they threw a lot of short stuff to him in the flat. He had 31 catches in 2017. He was over 7 yards a carry, which seems to be like the magic number with a lot of these guys. And I just the power that he brought to the table. And also, I talked about the Gilmore game against Manheim Central. Iggy's game against Cumberland Valley in the district final, I'll never forget that. In 2016, because at halftime it did not look good against Cumberland Valley. And Iggy took over the game. I mean, he was a man possessed in the second half. In fact, not that it means anything, but so each year at the radio station, we would submit a game for the PAB Awards, which is Pennsylvania Association of Broadcasting, and that was the game we submitted, and we won for the
it was a good game.
Best local sports coverage. But that was a game, so I should thank Iggy for the award I have somewhere. But that game always sticks out to me, the way they came back, and so you could easily put him up there. Jami was on my honorable mention list too. Jami, I always viewed as lightning in a bottle. Like, it didn't matter if they were on the 10, 20, 30, 40, like, he could go on any play. And we talked about yards per carry. He's tied for first, 8.6. Now, as a junior, which was my senior year, so I actually started a little broadcasting back when BCTV would pick up the game. So I announced a bunch of Jami's games when I was still in high school. But Rob Ruth was part of the running back mix. And then Matt Nadrowski was a very good fullback who got some catches some of the time. But then Jami's 95 season was one of the best in Wilson history, about 1,600 rushing yards there. So, when you look for like electric players, I think that's a good adjective. Jami is right there because of how he could go the distance, on any play. And also, we talked about Austin being a great defensive back. Jami was phenomenal on defense.
Yeah, Jami, what are you coaching now?
Defensive backs.
So he was part of my list. We talked about Jeff Nadrowski. It was funny. So the reason my face is bright red is I played pickleball for about 4 hours today with a former Bulldog, Kurt Kelly, who's a very good player by the end and was a good tight end too. Maybe he would be on that list. But Mike Vecchio was also over there in West Reading. So when I told Mike we're doing this show, he said, "Oh, Jeff Nadrowski's got to be in your top 5." I'm like, "Well, funny thing, Mike, he isn't."
He isn't.
And then I started rattling off the names to him, and he's like, "Man, that's tough." Yeah, and then so again, there's no like right or wrong answer here.
No.
It's personal preference, but Jeff's 91 season, obviously the Mifflin game. I mean, and maybe that's why Vecchio mentioned Nadrowski, because he had 319 yards against the Mustangs and 6 touchdowns in that one game.
Which is only recently tied by Iggy Renoso in the playoff game. When I first put this out about a month or so ago and announced it and put out the image I had made, I think Coach Steve O'Neill from Why I'm Missing retweeted it out there, and the Nadrowski brothers grabbed onto it and saw it, and they were like, "No doubt, Jeff's number 1." And I was like, "You're gonna have to tune in to find out." So obviously he's gonna be on the list for sure. And I think I don't remember which one it said, 300 plus yards in a game, and I was like, "Yeah, you're right," but 2 others did it as well.
Yeah.
So,
and I don't know the circumstances of all those games, but I remember, he did that in half.
Yeah,
it was
the 6 touchdowns were in the first half. Yeah,
and he got shut down, and it was the right thing to do. But I know, man.
In the locker room, everyone was asking Doug to put him back in to get a 7, because it would have eclipsed LaShawn McCoy's record, which is, I believe, is still 6, unless someone's passed since then. I don't know.
Journey Brown.
Did Journey Brown probably like
the
700
yard?
Well, but
game
I think wasn't it a playoff record? Did Journey Brown do that? In the
was
playoffs?
a playoff game.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, Paul, then your last just missed is a recent one, not as recent as Iggy, but right there in front of him, Shane Dantzler.
Yep, Shane Dantzler. Unfortunate situation with his senior year when he got injured, because if he stays healthy, he's the all-time leading rusher in Wilson history, which is a nice feather in your cap when you talk about the tradition and all the championships that this program has won. But his senior year, which was 2015, he only had 540 rushing yards that year because he was banged up. He still finished with over 3,300, which puts him 4th on the career list, even with the injury his senior year. And he was another guy who was 7 yards a carry.
Yeah, I mean, I was at Manheim Township when he came back after his injury that first game, and I'll tell you what, for only having one healthy leg, he did some pretty nice stuff against us that night. It was really hard to stop.
Shane was in Electric Town. He was the first one. So he came to the first year of Wilson West. He was a 7th grader. I was coaching at Wilson Central, which they changed the system and they created West. And he walked over to us in the summer of 2010 and introduced himself to me and Coach Fernsler. And we're like, "Oh, so you're going to 8th grade?" He's like, "No, 7th." And we're like, "Oh." And he walks over to join the throw around practice we're doing. Fernsler was like, "Well, I guess we found our running back." And he was unstoppable on offense and defense. We had to take him out of games because he was literally hurting people. And then this is middle school football, 7th and 8th grade football. But, he's running around as a 7th grader, bigger, faster, stronger than everyone on the field. And then we talked to some of the coaches after putting up some ungodly number because no one could stop him. And we'd be like, "Yeah, we'll see you next year because he's back with us next year." They just couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe it. And then following him up through, obviously, he had to be pulled up to the high school team as a freshman. And I just remember his freshman year was that 2012 team, which was just incredible, especially defensively. They had such a great team. They would usually be winning games because other opponents couldn't really score that much, and Shane would get the time to play, and he'd rip off a big run, student section. He's a freshman. 4 years of Shane Dantzler is going to do a program good. And like everything you just said, it's unfortunate he suffered that injury and missed some games his senior year because he would be a lot higher on a bunch of these lists. But even so, what he was able to do, and honestly, he wasn't really the feature back until he was a junior. His obviously freshman year, there was a bunch of guys in front of him, Jimmy Brooks and Jesse Poore, key among them. But then in 2013, a guy that doesn't have the stats on here, but someone who I think is vastly underrated when it comes to Wilson running backs, John Race Snyder. And that entire 2013 team was so good when no one thought they would be. And I know that's a feather in their cap all the time. Everyone doubted them. They were the team that was only going to win 5 or 6 games. People told them that all summer long. And they came out, and it was because of the attitude and demeanor of the players like John Snyder, who really was the lead guy, even with Shane in the backfield. It was still John Snyder getting those carries and seeing him not willing to go down. And that's kind of the attitude that a lot of Wilson running backs have had. But then Shane, that 2014 team, we've talked about the 2014 team on this show all the time. They had an incredible run, and that was a season of Shane Dantzler in that offense. That was a great year to watch, and Shane had some absolutely incredible runs.
What was Shane's playing weight? Do you remember?
He was small.
I was just gonna say that. Yeah,
because his squat numbers, if I'm mistaken, as a sophomore, definitely as a junior, was 600 plus.
He was, yeah. I always feel like he looked the same as when we saw him as 7th grader as when he got to high school.
He was not tall at all. I mean, he was short back.
The performance on the field, just electric. Electric.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not saying he was Barry Sanders at all, but he made the first guy miss. Like, I always viewed Shane as more shifty than fast. Like, to me, Rodney Gillen was like straight line burner. Not that Shane certainly wasn't slow, but no. You know what I mean? Like, he had this like natural ability to just, he was vision. An ankle breaker.
He had great vision and agility.
Yeah.
It was something.
But I never would saw him as like a 4.4 type of guy, and he wasn't big, but man, I mean, he was really fun to watch.
All right. I think that covers it for Paul's list. We got your top 5, your just missed. We threw out a bunch of other names, but I'm going to let Justin do his now. Again, there's a lot of overlaps. So some of these guys, actually probably most of these guys we've already touched on. We can throw out a few more about it. We'll let Justin talk a little bit about your top 5, and I'll pull it up for you right now so you can get started.
So I mentioned this at the intro, like, this was so hard. This was so hard. Joey and I did a show like before, different thing, but like, we're like, who's the best baseball player of all time? I honestly had an easier time with that. And that's a ridiculous question because there's like people who, but like,
it's Babe Ruth.
See, I said it was
Willie Mays.
Willie Mays didn't pitch. That's the X factor. Babe Ruth is a great pitcher.
It's true. But like, we went through and we just went through this stuff. But like, here, I'm like, oh my gosh. And I really struggled to like put out of mind like the guys that I've actually seen, and knowing that there were so many great backs that I did not see. And like, I didn't have that benefit of growing up and seeing at least, another decade of guys, which when we went through the list includes a bunch of greats. They were all before my time here. I know I tell Joey this story all the time. It was the fall of 99. My dad went to Wilson and my uncle was on that 67 team and all that stuff. But my dad was at that Wilson Manheim Central game in 99 here. We didn't live here yet. We didn't know we were moving here yet, but good friends of ours, still super close family friends, they lived in Manheim Central. They wanted to come down. My dad's like, yeah, sure. Cause he was going to go with my grandfather to the game and they watched it. My dad came home and was like, you'll never believe like this game. It was nuts. The crowd, like all this stuff. Yeah, I grew up in Columbia. There's 2,000 people. It's the biggest game of the year, against Lancaster Catholic usually at the time. Yeah,
it's all good.
Right, we've talked about that. But so it was just a lot harder for me. I did go a lot on the numbers in a way for me to kind of step aside at least a little bit, or at least maybe it's the flip. Maybe for me to rationalize why I have some of the guys where I have them. I went Rodney number 1. And so all that talk about like, oh yeah, me trying to distance myself, and I go with the guy who stands out because I got to see him play. It's just, man, Rodney, when he would get the ball, if he got past the guy, he was gone. Yeah. Like, he was gone, and it was just absolutely ridiculous being able to watch him play. A couple of years ago, he helps out with like some of the youth football and stuff, and he'll be running around. There's these little kids, and still, this is a decade later. Rodney's not old, but like these kids, like they know he's fast, they know he's good. They have no idea how good he was, and it's funny because he'll just like, he'll be there in untied, sneakers and just like, have like his phone in his pocket, all that stuff, and he'll just like make these kids miss like crazy. But man, Rodney was just awesome to kind of see. I had Pete as number 2. Again, kind of just looking at just the numbers kind of were everywhere. That legendary 99 game, which I have only heard of, like I wasn't there, but like hearing of those games, like, and actually having, like I said, I don't have a lot of firsthand experience with a lot of those, but like I do for that one. And that story kind of stood out to me. It was there. I remember, so when I moved to Wilson, John Gilmore was there working out for the draft, and I'm just like, that may be the biggest guy I've ever seen, like in high school. Like he was just massive. And again, I was coming from a single A school where they're trying to get 22 guys so they can practice, like that kind of thing. So it was just a different world to see these types of athletes. One of my friends at Columbia scored 5 touchdowns in a game, and he had under 40 yards rushing. He was the fullback, but inside the 10, they give him the ball.
Mike Allstott.
Right, he was. He wrestled heavyweight at Penn State, like big dude. And it was funny because then he was on like the Tri-County All-Star team with some of the guys that I graduated with, like Ian Firestone and some of the linemen were there, like, and they're like, "Hey, this guy." I'm like, "Yeah, I can tell you lots of stories," but I went with Iggy number 3. Again, I did have a tough time, like, because I knew he did have that time before Wilson, but I tried to think about what he did here, knowing it's so different. And that's not to devalue what he did. It's just, I don't know how to kind of to place that. Because like watching him play and watching him, yeah, he walked in. I had Iggy in class, and he walked in, and you're just like, oh my gosh. Like, hey, this kid's a 10th grader? Like, this kid's a 10th grader. When he moved in, I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, kids, I had heard, you hear like, oh, this kid at Hamburg is like everybody up.
And that, people often will disparage, he's doing, and so, because I get to see almost all the teams, I feel like I can differentiate and tell even the Wilson fans or Mifflin fans, I'm like, no, like, this kid's going to be a player wherever he's at.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Irrelevant.
Right. Exactly. And it was one of those, he walked into my, cause you hear, oh, this kid's moving from Hamburg. He walks into my class. I'm just like, oh my goodness. Got my attention. Like you said, like just ripped.
Yeah.
And he's 15 or 16 years old, and you're just like, oh man.
Adding him to the 2016 team too.
Right.
Like, what a team for him to come in on.
So then I went with Nadrowski next. And again, kind of mentioned, I'm trying to balance like, the performance based on numbers, but also the performance based on the teams and the team success. And those teams were so successful as Wilson teams kind of get. And then my 5th was Jami Sands. I talked about the
now,
numbers.
did you know he was coming in?
No,
before
I did not. I sent it.
It's funny you didn't say anything last week about it.
Right. Well, actually, and that's true. Like Jamie and I have had lots of discussions about it, but I did not mention it. And I was like, you never know.
I actually meant to put Jamie second. Can we change that?
Switch it up. Jamie was technically a late addition to this because we've been working on this. I reached out to you in March to talk about this, and we've been working on stats, and I said, hey, can you get me my top 5 weeks ago, because I wanted to do all this stuff. And then talking with Justin, I was like, do you think Jamie would come on the show? He's like, I'll talk to him.
That's good.
Well, I think it's interesting because everybody's bringing Nadrowski up, but like when he played, he had a nickname, and nobody's calling him by his nickname.
Nitro.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Nitro. Yeah, no, it's a great nickname for a running back.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Jeff Nadrowski is one, I already said, the 90s bias in me, he's always the one that's going to pop in my head. And it was nice. Paul mentioned him. Justin's got him in the top 5. He it's funny, after the success of the 89 and 90 teams, of which Jeff was a part of the 90 team, I believe.
He was a leading rusher, 90.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, it was after 89, and it's articles about the 90 team, and they didn't know who was going to take over, like who was going to be the guy with Mccarty gone. And the article, typical Slemmer fashion, underselling, and I don't know if we got anyone coming back. I don't know who's going to be the running back. All this stuff.
That sounds so familiar to the preseason articles now.
Let's go. I have on the BulldogHour.com. I have the history and heritage site, and you can go in, like, look in the early 90 and 91. It must be the 90 season. I don't know who's going to be. I don't know who's going to carry the ball. We lost all of our backfield. We don't have anyone that's going to. And 91, it's like, well, Nadrowski paid off pretty good in the 90 season.
So who had the most carries in one season at Wilson? Because when I went through, it was Nitro. And I think it was like 279 carries in like
is there single season
10, 11 games.
I don't have
I know he had the most carries like in a season when I was going through. So every time you say we don't know who's going to carry the ball, I have a feeling they had a pretty good idea.
Yeah, well, right, but they weren't letting anyone know about that. Right, but they had a pretty good idea. Yeah, Nadrowski.
Right, so he ended with 494, which is second all time total. Now, so that would include the other ones, but
so who's number one there?
Jake Stopper.
All right.
It's not close.
Which is a good segue because Justin, let's talk about your just missed running backs.
Yeah, so when we go into the ones where we just missed, I talk about Jake Stopper, and again, not to hammer the point again, but that was that weird time between, like, I wasn't here for high school anymore, but I hadn't come back to the area and started teaching yet, but like it was always kind of like I would hear about it because I followed along. That's just kind of what I do. And he was just always there. But Jake Stopper, 699 career carries. That's more than 200 more than second place. Like that. And
his brother started as a freshman.
Yes, and that's Dylan, that's what I remember. I remember there were just games where it felt like he was carrying the ball 30 sometimes
because he was
right. Yeah. and it wasn't like oh he did it this week. Well, we'll give him off. No, he did it again the next week. Yeah. He got the ball all the time. Talk about those teams where, well, who's going to get it? Well, Jake Stopper's going to get it, and he's going to get it a lot. And it's just one of those things where just that workhorse mentality and going through those teams, and those were some interesting teams. It was senior year was 2007, but just like that. Being able to carry the ball nearly 700 times, one short of 700 times, like that's crazy.
How many games played?
I don't.
So he was a senior in the fall of 2007. Did he play as a freshman? See, this is my college year, so I'm not around.
So Dylan started as a freshman.
Okay,
know that. I think Jake was more sophomore, junior, senior.
Yeah. Okay, so that would be 5, 6, 7. I'm trying to think. Well, I mean, you're looking at mid-30s probably some mid to upper 30s in number of games.
Even if he was like the starter for 3 years, you're talking like over 230 carries a season, averaging over 3 years.
Like I was a premier guy in my senior year. I was lucky to carry the ball 30 times every day of the time. Like I maybe averaged 16 carries.
Right, exactly. So like it's one of those things. Well, and here we go. Actually, it has it in the single season. So,
okay.
So he had 231 carries in 2005. This is insane. And 231 carries in 2006. And then which is pretty much right on
238 then as a senior. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm trying to look here.
Well, it's consistent.
So
yeah, it is very consistent.
Yeah,
and I can give you the games played too because 2005 they were 7-3.
Okay, 10.
2006 they were 11-2.
Okay, 23.
And 2007 they were 9-4. So
36. That's what I said. Yeah, right. Mid-30s.
So this is just a crazy anomaly here.
Yeah.
In 2005, he rushed for 1,269 yards on 231 carries for a 5.5 yard average. The next year, 1,262. 7 yards difference on the same number of carries, so it averages out to 5.5 yards. His stat, he's in here at 15 and 16. It's the same. There's 7 yards difference. That's it. And that was his sophomore and junior year. And then his senior year isn't on this list, so the yards are probably lower, which, but it's just, that's crazy.
That very weird coincidence. So yeah, Jake Stopper was someone who I don't know a lot about because that was the time where I was not in the area, and unfortunately we didn't have everything being presented to us via video or on social media, at least not the way it is now, to keep up with things. So I didn't get to see any of Jake's career, but just the numbers in the stats book that he just mentioned, I was like, this is a guy that I need to learn more about.
Very consistent, durable. Athletically, he wasn't a Alex Austin, Rodney Gillen, Shane Dantzler. He wasn't that guy. But, I mean, put up huge career numbers.
I had Alex Austin, and we've talked a bunch about him. Just, again, like, from, the numbers back it up, but also just, like, the legend. Like, he would just go out there, and, man, he'd just destroy guys. Mike Ritz, the legendary guy, whether it's the timing and building the program. I talked about it. My uncle was on that undefeated
Your
team.
uncle's not going to be happy with you. You didn't have him in your top 5.
He made the just miss.
Right. And that's where like it was hard, like, because I'm like, oh man, like what, and that's where my bias came through, and the numbers, and just kind of looking, and wasn't sure, but he had to be on there. And I got to give a quick shout out to the guys who were broadcasting. I know it was a hard time in part because of the crowd, the Central York playoff game this year, because I got up there to the camera on the sideline and they start peppering me with Wilson history questions. I'm like, listen, man, like, I appreciate what you're doing. You were talking to the wrong guy. Like, I know more than like a lot of people who are going to be sitting in the stands, but like, my buddy right there, he could answer so much more of this for you.
I was like, we need to switch spots.
Right, I'm texting back and forth with Joey because I knew some of the answers to the questions he was asking, but some of them I didn't. And then that guy's just dropping like little things. I could hear him like on their broadcast. It was really cool. And then I had my last one of the honorable or just missed guys was Jaden Jones, and just like the way you look at this year, the way that team just turned into. Again, we're going to run it. We're going to run it.
Come and stop us.
And he was just going to... And again, seeing Jaden kind of transform over the years into that role was kind of cool. I felt like he had to be on there. Like, and it's interesting because it wasn't necessarily any one thing that was like earth-shattering, but I feel like... and it might be some recency bias there of just seeing him and the way... he was able to play this year and last year, and kind of get on there and no pun intended, like carry the team and help carry the team forward a little bit was noteworthy in my opinion.
And you also saw when he wasn't on the field,
right? Well,
how different the team
and you look at numbers. And I know we don't want to get too much into the what ifs, but there were a couple of things this year where like he wasn't there, and we've talked about this. There are certain things, and like the Mannheim Central game, like I feel like that game is different, but
absolutely.
But even that stuff aside, you look at last year, the schedule was so weird. Like the number of games was so much less last year through no fault of anyone. They were 5-1 or 6-1.
It was 7 games.
Okay, yeah. So they went 6-1
in 2020.
Yeah, two seasons ago. But, like, that's going to skew some of the numbers there a little bit in a team, and he was certainly a big part of that team. And so, like, that was just a crazy thing that hopefully we don't have to worry about for another however long, messing with seasons like that. But so it's kind of hard to wrap around, like, some of those career total numbers for Jaden because of that 2020 season.
Yeah, but there's something to be said about, when Jaden's in the backfield, what's coming.
Right.
Let's play.
Right. And that's what was so fun. I mean, Justin and I talked about this literally every week on this show, especially after week about 7, when things really like every team knows what's coming and they cannot stop.
It's either him or Brad.
Right.
Yeah. Well, like the end of the Hempfield game, like 3 minutes, and I'm like, oh man, I think they're gonna get it, and they just did. They just did. They just ran down the field and did it.
It's
and
like, yeah,
they just
something
do it week and week and week. Yeah,
when that identity came in, that was fun to watch. Jaden was one that was one of those pleasant surprises when I was doing the research for this. He's also the second guy behind just Shane that when he came to us at West, I was like, this is going to be a player in the future. I hope he sticks with it. And I mean, you could, when he got up there and got an opportunity, even as a sophomore, mostly more at linebacker than a running back, as a sophomore, you could tell that he was in for big things. And the unfortunate things, especially with that pandemic season of only getting 7 games, you add another 4, 5, 6, 7 games in his career. How high up is he on this list?
And that team. Like, that team was,
was
really good.
It was a really good team. They ran into a buzzsaw against Mifflin at the beginning and then got slighted by District 3 come playoff time. A lot of what ifs there, but that was one of the real bright spots in the research here of seeing Jaden's name pop up there. And then I had to do that mostly through Max Preps because we don't have the new book yet because his career wasn't over when the latest book came out. So it'll be interesting to see how many lists he shows up in, but I made sure to add him to the career rushing list based on what was on the Max Prep profile, and he's sitting there at number 11 right behind Jami Sands in career rushing. So that was Justin's list and his just miss. So we'll wrap things up here with mine. Pretty sure we've talked about all of these guys already, and I'll touch on them just briefly so we can wrap things up here. But before I go to my top 5, I just want to mention the guys that I played with. We talked about all of them, I think, before we started the show tonight. We talk about great backfields. We mentioned the one from the 90s all the way up through. I mentioned it just kept cycling through, and there were teams that had those guys overlap, and it's incredible to think about. The fall of 02 team, which the Tradition Club is honoring for our 20th anniversary of our undefeated LL championship this fall on September 9th against Martin Luther King. It was another backfield by committee, and it featured Dean Millard, Desmond Boyd, and Travis Mosser. And it's incredible to watch the highlight video, which I put up on YouTube, actually exists for all 3 of my seasons, and to be able to reminisce and watch those is really awesome. But how if one of the guys got stopped or needed more on defense, the other 2 could step up. It was a lot of fun to watch. So I just wanted to mention Desmond, Dean, and Travis there. And then one other guy who popped up and isn't on these lists because he only had 1 year as a starter. And Justin and I mentioned him a lot now, nearly 4 years ago when he was a senior. But Elijah Morales kind of bought in to the Wilson way. Like, you step up as a senior. You didn't get a lot of opportunities early. And all he did, you still have the single season up. He ended up having the 18th most rushing yards in Wilson history in a single season. A guy who barely played at least as a running back earlier in his career. And, people wondering, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And we had talked because we had coached him. Elijah can do it. If he gets the opportunity, he can do it. And he did it in a big way for that 2018 team.
He was really fast.
He was a fun one to watch.
He ended up with over 1,100 yards on 179 carries and 6.3 average. Just real quick, another one that if we look at the teams that Zach Groffel.
Yeah, I was just gonna say him.
You look at those guys. That 2018 again. That one's unique to me because that's the first one when I wasn't in school. That I was back in the air. I was teaching at that point, and that team was so good.
He had 1,700 yards that year. Now they played a lot of games because they got to the state semis, and that team was really well known for their defense. In fact, Coach Doms told me during that run it was the best defense in Wilson history. Now there's some from the late 70s, early 80s that would certainly be in the mix there. But
talk to Coach Walber about that.
But 2008, no one did anything against them until the state semifinal. I mean, that was so up front with Rodney Hill and I mean all 3 levels. They were completely loaded. But yeah, Groff had a monster year, but maybe didn't get as much attention as some of the other star players that year.
Yeah, that 2008 team, again, not when I was around here, so I was living vicariously through Justin, who was like telling me how good this team was, and I actually did get to catch them at the district championship where they just blew the doors off of Cumberland Valley, who I hear was like talking trash leading up to the game. And
yeah, go back and look at the scores in that 2008 season. It was a demolition derby.
I ripped their footage on mini DV discs. I had to hook up with Coach Palm to get the proper equipment to rip those. As we transitioned from DVDs to Huddle, there was this mini DV transition, and then we had to get the right equipment. I just ran through the entire 2008 season, unfortunately missing a couple games, but I'm like, I need to watch these because that team is talked about as one of the best ever.
And look at the number of touchdowns allowed when the starting defense was still in the game. I mean, it was hardly any until the state semi.
The total defensive games, and this is through 15 games, gave up under 1,000 yards rushing at 995, under 1,600 yards total passing. So they gave up just over 2,500 total yards through 15 games.
And I wonder the points.
Total points 137.
Okay, and in the state semi that they gave, it was that 38-35? Yeah. It was that triple overtime with Bethel Park. Yep. So before that they had allowed 100 points in 14 games.
Right. They averaged 9.1 points a game, and here we go. The average margin of victory was 30.5.
Yeah.
Justin, are they sitting alone at average margin of victory?
It's highlighted here, so I'm running through. I believe they are.
What was the total again?
30.5.
30.5. That is nuts. That is nuts.
Yeah.
Okay, we can't go into this any further. But apparently we have like a greatest teams discussion coming up in our future. But all right, so my top 5 here to round this out is all guys we've mentioned. There's no one new on this list. I'll start at the bottom though. Number 5, my last one on the list was Nitro, Jeff Nadrowski. Again, I'm not sure we can say much more about it. The highlight film that he was against Mifflin, and what he was able to do, stepping into a role that Coach Slemmer wanted to make sure people knew. I don't know if Wilson can keep churning out these guys, and Nitro just came in and became one of the greatest running backs to play for the program. So he's my number 5, and he was a senior in the fall 91. Iggy is my number 4. I mean, we've covered what Renoso was able to do, and to think what could he have done if he had another 2 years at Wilson, because what he did at Hamburg was just phenomenal. It would have been great to see him add some of those numbers earlier in his career, but what he did, the funny thing to me about Iggy is he didn't really get his footing with the Wilson team in terms of grasping the offense and what he was able to do until midway through 2016. Yeah, that's a good
point.
Because I remember he was used sparingly at times to try to make sure that he understood his responsibilities. And then once it clicked, he was unstoppable. It was incredible to watch him be helped along, because Tommy O'Brien was a great guy to help him there in the backfield, as the two of them were able to early in that 2016 season kind of be a duo back there until Iggy got going.
The blocking schemes were totally different from what Hamburg was running to, obviously, with Wilson in his spread.
Yes, and when he got going, I mean, he didn't stop because he had 2 great years for Wilson. So he's my number 4.
I will say one game we were playing against him, and my D lineman went to the wrong gap. It didn't take that much of a mistake. He was gone, man. He was gone.
Yeah. My number 3 is Alex Austin. Again, just someone who I remember hearing his name all the time at the Wilson Stadium. It wasn't even Gursky yet when Alex was playing. Just hearing Alex Austin and what he was able to do, just absolutely stellar accomplishments. Not just on offense and on defense, like we said, and how great of a defensive back he was. And Alex Austin was someone that I knew was going to be on my list, and I'm glad that my expectations were met when going through this. And then my number 2 was Pete Gilmore. Pete Gilmore I'm not sure you can say much more than we already did. It showed his highlight film, which didn't even include his senior year. It's just left and right. He could do it. He felt like an all-around back. He could win with power, but also with speed. Incredible athlete all around. I know he's the one that I heard from a lot of people that they thought that he would be up near the top when this discussion happened, and he was in the top 5 for all 3 of our lists. Then my number 1, because I'm an analytics guy, is Rodney Gillen. Which
so
is,
both of you had him.
Yeah, we did, and that's why I said. Now our lists were very, very close.
Yeah. Except I'm the only one that had Ritz in my top 5.
You are, and I know we'll hear about that.
Right.
The longtime fans are gonna
and well, they'll also like. I'm sure they'll be happy that you started with Mike Ritz and you had him at 1, and they're gonna be upset that we didn't name anyone else. Because from Ritz, the next closest guy was Mccarty, I think. I don't know that we talked in depth. I talked about Vito Ninfo being on the
Another point there, and I have to thank my buddy Kevin Venino for pointing this out. So some of those great Wilson teams of the late 70s and early 80s used 3 running backs.
Right.
So you're not going to have the same type of numbers, and Vito was part of that
Shrek
group.
and Ertz.
Right, Shrek played at Lehigh. There's when you have 3 different guys getting the football.
Yeah. I do feel like a lot of those great teams before the playoffs, a lot of them were done by committee. It was a multi-faceted group. There was not just one guy, there was 2 or 3. And then when you throw in the fullbacks too, if you separate them, there's a lot of people back there because you throw Leroy in there with a few of those guys and how they overlapped. There's a lot of people and you only got one football. But yeah, I don't think it's recency bias, but I think things are just different. And, Mike Ritz certainly needs to be discussed, and we've done that a lot tonight. And he's on my just miss because he did just miss because it was him and Pete Gilmore were the 2 that always Wilson running backs. I always heard everyone talk about Mike Ritz, and then growing up and watching, I always thought of Pete Gilmore. So those were always my 2. I don't have anything against Mike Ritz and the old style of play. I just I watched all of these guys play and in person. I didn't have that opportunity for Mike Ritz or any of the other guys. So I'm always open to people listening and talking about watching those guys play in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s that I didn't get to watch. But yeah, so my list is Nadrowski, Renoso, Austin, Gilmore, and Rodney Gillen. I didn't, honestly, going into this, I didn't think Rodney would be my number 1. I definitely knew he would be in the discussion, and getting to see him firsthand, especially his senior, I know his 2010 season was statistically better in terms of numbers, but watching him that 2011 season, what he was able to do, just whenever they needed him, he always came through. And it was a great year to watch, a great career to be able to see. And that was right when I moved back here to be reintroduced to Wilson football, featuring someone like Rodney was a great, I'm like, oh yeah, that's how things are done around here. So yeah, I mean, and I didn't want to adhere strictly to like, all right, well, he's number 1 on all-time career rushing. He has to be my number 1. Right. So I immediately was like, not discounting him, just being like, don't go by that. Mm-hmm. That's not most important. And then you go to some of the other things. All right, well, let's check out yards per carry. Oh, Rodney's number 1 in that too, tied with Jami. 8.6 in a career. Average 8.6 yards per carry. It's mind-boggling to think that for an entire career you can gain almost a first down on every carry.
Yeah.
And
well,
Wilson
2010
season,
season,
not one
did.
but 2 guys.
He wasn't 10 yards a carry.
Well, I was running off tackle behind John. and the other thing I want to point out is Iggy Renoso, he actually had the career leading in Berks County, but who did he beat? A Gilmore.
Yeah, it was David.
Was Pete's uncle.
Right.
Well, actually, but then Nate Romig.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, you're right.
Nate
he was
Romig
in there.
surpassed Gilmore, and then obviously Nick Singleton crushed everything.
We don't talk about that name on this show.
Wasn't me.
Hey, didn't you guys say when he goes to Penn State?
Hey,
you're right.
Starting
Blue
yesterday,
White game was this weekend.
Starting yesterday, I saw his. I sent Joey the clip of him scoring from the 3, and Joey was like, would have loved to seen that in one of the 9 2-point conversion attempts
against Illinois last year.
Oh yeah.
So Rodney's a number 1 in all-time career rushing. He's tied for first in career yards per carry. He's 4th in scoring by running backs. Number of basically touchdowns or 2-point conversions, what have you. Iggy just beat him out by a little bit. Pete Gilmore 372 points, just insane. But and then Gillen has not 1 but 2 of the top 5 single season rushing. So he was putting up the numbers and doing it like you said. Yards per carry in his junior season of 2010, 10.3. He touched the ball and he'd get you a first down. Unreal. So Rodney Gillen ended up being my number 1, and Justin and me. When Justin sent me his list and I saw that, I was like, oh man.
Right. Yeah, he didn't tell me. He was just like, oh yeah, there's definitely some overlap. I'm like, well, I would hope so. Like if I sent it to him, he's like, no, you did this wrong. Like I would have felt awful.
I slide it across the desk. You might want to rethink a few of your answers. No, nothing like that. No, we were all very close. So that's my top 5, and then my just missed again. We talked about all of these guys except for one. My we'll get to him last, but next, Jamie, you just missed the cut, bud. I'm sorry, but you were right there to the bitter end. Nitro edged you out. So.
Yeah, it's all good.
You needed a better nickname.
Well, that was the other one. The other nickname you haven't said tonight was Alex Austin's, and I was surprised by that.
I don't know Alex.
Oh, really? Yeah, he had T-shirts and everything. It was the A-Train.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
you know.
Yeah. I need to find one of those shirts. That needs to be added to the archive.
You know it's out there. Somebody's got one.
Well, now almost 3 years ago when we did the 75th season reunion and flag football game and everything, Coach Stopai came home and presented me with a shirt from the 94 season when it was the 50th season celebration, and I didn't have that. So when he gave it to me, I was super, super excited that he presented that and he wanted me to add it to the archive. So yeah, Jamie, I always associated Wilson running backs with you because you were right there at the front of my head growing up, watching you and Nitro and Alex and Pete run around the turf.
Yeah, Nitro and Brian Mccarty, definitely. And as I understand, Brian went on to Townsend then. And if I understand it correct, he broke some of Dave Beckett's records at Townsend.
He had a huge career at Townsend, yes.
Yep. I know he's in the Hall of Fame.
I was going to say, I'm pretty sure he's in the Hall of Fame there. So, yeah, it was great. So Jami Sands was on there. Shane Dantzler, we already talked about Shane a lot. What he was able to do, watching him come up through the middle school and into the high school, and sometimes it's tough to meet expectations, especially when they're sky high. And Shane got there, so I'm not sure you can expect much else. And I think he always has to be in the conversation when it comes to best running backs to ever play at Wilson. Then Mike Ritz. We've talked a bunch about Mike Ritz because you can't talk about Wilson running backs or Wilson football without the great running ability of Mike Ritz and what he contributed to the program at the infancy of the Gursky years. Those first few years as the program was kind of finding its footing and setting a foundation. Mike Ritz is all about that. And then the last one we haven't mentioned much, but was on the list because I got to play with him briefly as a sophomore, is Chaz Logan.
Oh yeah,
he was a great back, really talented,
good basketball player too.
Yeah. And because of the guys I mentioned at the top of my dialogue here, Travis Mosser, Dean Millard, and Desmond Boyd, didn't need him much as a sophomore. He didn't get a lot of playing time at the beginning of games, but when he got to get his opportunity later, because with a guy by the name of Chad Henny under center, we were winning a lot of games by a lot of points. The underclassmen got a lot of playing time, and Chaz was when he steps on the field, kind of like Shane did in 2012 as a freshman, and they yelling about how you got to look forward to this for the next few years. That was the same thing with Chaz, what he did when healthy as a sophomore, and hearing what he was doing in the JV games, and then he exploded as a junior. Chad's senior year, Chaz's junior year in 2003, and then had an incredible senior season in the fall of 2004. So he was another guy that came to mind when talking about Wilson's greatest running backs. So, yeah, I think we did it. I think we covered it. We don't have a unanimous decision, but I feel like our list came pretty close.
Give points to where we ranked them and see. So the lower number would work well.
You bring that up. I actually did do that.
Oh, did you? Okay.
I did.
Great minds think alike.
So Chris Herb says Jami Sands is definitely top 5 all time.
Hey, thanks, Chris. If I see you out, I'll take care of you.
So actually, here, let me pull it up. I'm afraid to do it on my computer because I don't want it to crash. So let me pull it. I sent it to myself. I have it right here. All right. So the point system. It would be Rodney Gillen, Pete Gilmore, Alex Austin, Mike Ritz, and Iggy Renoso would edge out 6th place Jeff Nadrowski and 7th place Jami Sands.
Was that a Google document or a Google sheet? Yeah, there you go.
So I would love to pull it up on the computer, but I got a lot running right now that I'm afraid might crash it. So there you go. I mean Gillen, Gilmore, Austin, Ritz, Reynoso. You can tell a pretty good story about Wilson football with those names. So yeah, a lot of fun. Always great to do these research and come up with the graphics and talk to people who are interested in this topic, and a lot of people were. So I expect to hear from many people, and Jamie will be the first one to bear the brunt when he sees the coaching staff of well, you didn't talk about this guy or you didn't bring up that guy.
Oh, I'm sure they'll be very understanding.
Well, I remember 3 years ago at the end of 2019, I did like a decade recap, and I did like best of the decade, but it was just me. Like I didn't talk to anyone else. I put it out there without. And Justin told me it's like there were some decisions the coaches didn't agree with.
Yeah, they would come up to me. They'd be like, "Hey, you guys put." I'm like, "Joey did it."
So this is how you have to respond, because I used to get this all the time in radio. But then you have to ask them, okay, if you don't think so and so is here or should be on the list, or you think someone should be on here, then who do you take off? Because if you put someone on, you have to take someone off. And then they'll stutter and stammer and probably won't answer you. But
see, this is the experience Paul has from putting out his rankings all the time.
These things are great to do. Yeah,
absolutely.
I never got as nervous as Joe because I find them fun. And it stimulates conversation, which is good. It brings up a lot of great memories, which is good. People are going to disagree. That's fine. I mean, we don't all like the same ice cream. We don't all like the same foods or drinks. But there's nothing wrong with that. So I would be curious to hear from the coaches or the diehard longtime fans, for their list, and with that caveat that if you want to put someone else on, then you have to take somebody else off, and then it becomes difficult to do.
Yeah, anyone that wants to submit a list, leave a comment. I'll read them next show. I'll follow it up in June when we have our next show. You want to lift your top 5? I will more than happy to read those off. That'd be a great little listener feedback and opinion to go in there.
So what's the next position? Wide receiver,
I feel like
tight
receiver. End. But you can't combine them. They're just too different.
Yeah, and wide receiver really limits.
Now you're
the era you go.
Yeah, you're really. I mean, honestly, I'm not sure you can go back much more than 30,
well, even
30
when you
years.
played, Jamie, you guys threw the ball like 10 times a game.
And very, very proficiently too.
Yeah,
they're very efficient.
Yeah, but like receivers are not going to have. And then it exploded when Coach Cantafio took over, and the passing numbers, and so those. Like it's totally impossible to compare just numbers for receivers. So that would get you, but there's still a lot of good ones.
I don't know.
So on the top career receptions list,
he's ruining the next show.
I won't even say it. There are only 2 seasons in the top 22 prior to like prior to the 1990 season. Like,
Okay.
they're all in the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh, easily. Yeah, you could draw a line there.
Yeah. So
What's the award that the colleges have for the best offensive line in Division I football?
The entire line?
Yes, it's the entire line.
I
I'll
don't
tell you
know.
what. I mean, I would like to hear that over the years. What was the best overall offensive lines? Because because they all complement each other in special ways. I mean,
right. It's tough. I mean, yeah, that's the discussion for Big Brubaker and Coach Stop By. We got to bring them in. They could help us out with that.
I mean, the one line had Brzezinski, Toth, Stahl, and I believe Bradburn was the tight end. I mean,
I know. I would love to be able to talk. It's
if
tough to find.
If I knew more names, I'd say them.
It's tough to find information on that. That's why I remember in the late '90s, the Eagle did a big section on the offensive line. That was, I believe, for Austin or Gilmore. It was like 97, 98, somewhere in there. And Coach Stop By. And that was super cool. You know, as a kid playing offensive line in middle school, to see them showcasing the 5 offensive linemen and Coach Stop By, they just not enough press. But thankfully, it always seemed, at least in the 10 plus years I've been covering the team now, that the running backs, the skill positions are always very complimentary of the guys blocking it up front. And I would love to be able to go in depth with that. I just don't even know where you could start.
Yeah.
How do you? I mean, unless the offensive line coaches kept their grades from all the years,
right.
Yeah.
But that's really inside. You really have to dig deep to talk with Doms, Lorchek, Brubaker, Stop By, like, and all the assistants over the year. You know,
I'm sure they got some good stories though.
oh, absolutely. And those were guys that you'd have to have. We could have an offensive line episode, but you would have to have the coaches present, because I wouldn't even know where to begin. There's so many, at least 5 every year. At least with the running backs, generally, especially over the last 30 some years, there's one guy that steps up. You have a few years with lots of committees or a 1-2 punch, but the names on this list, by and large, were usually, at least for 2 years, the one guy doing most of the work, because they were such a spectacular talent. It's really hard to quantify that with the offensive line. But honestly, I think if we take this series somewhere else, and if we do another one, whether it's in June or it's not till the offseason next year, I feel like we're going to get a little bit more kind of what I did for like the decades thing, like top 5 Wilson games, top 5 Wilson. We could do Wilson defenses, even like doing like just the way that defensive schemes have changed. Like how do you go like edge? You call them edges now, or you go defensive ends and outside linebackers? Are they used in that manner, or do all linebackers are just inside line? Like,
this is like Fight Club. I can't talk about it.
No, we can't discuss it. Well, and then defensive backs, you split them up and just do the safeties. Do cornerback? I mean, Austin and Gilmore would probably be on that list. Jason Cape, who I feel like there's so many directions you could take this. I don't know if we can do any more.
Tight end would be a good position, because Wilson's had a lot of really good ones.
Yeah, we mentioned a bunch of them already tonight.
Yeah,
with John and Todd, and there's
Tyler
Beck. Yep. Yeah. So it'll be fun. We'll see what comes up. If anyone has suggestions, leave a comment, and we will definitely take it under consideration. But it's always fun to have a discussion topic like this in the off season, but it's April 24th. 4 months. We're almost 4 months away from the first game, and it might sound unrealistic or tough to believe, but I think it's 4 months from tomorrow or something like that. So
he's playing it off like he doesn't know.
Yeah,
he knows exactly.
Well, I always know in mid-May it's always 100 days till kickoff, so. Mid to end of May, like around May 20th or so is usually 100 days. So I know it's right around the corner. Well, we thank you guys for joining us, Paul and Jamie. This was fun. Any final words on our running backs tonight?
I think we covered it all, but thanks for having me, and I always appreciate you guys supporting what I've been doing with my website and my sponsors there, and all the retweets and all that stuff. So it doesn't go unnoticed, and I enjoy these type of shows, so it was fun.
I've loved seeing some of the baseball content the last couple weeks. It's been great.
Yeah. Yep.
I said to Justin before you got here, I was like, now could Paul give us like lines on who's gonna be the number one running back? Like this guy's got these odds, and I was like, probably doesn't talk about gambling on a show about college or a high school.
I needed one more rebound from Bam Adebayo tonight. I'm not a happy camper right now.
No.
He only got 8, and I had him at 8.5. So,
Tough.
Yeah.
Tough. Well, Jamie, appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great being here. I appreciate you having me on the show, and go Bulldogs this year.
Yeah, well, we're looking forward to watching the 2022 version of the Wilson football team, and we'll keep everyone up to date on the happenings of the team as we hear it or as we see it and as we're allowed to talk about it, as the case may be far too often. And yeah, Justin, anything else from you? Any final words about our running backs or anything else?
It was fun. I'm glad to have that like anxious burden off my chest of just saying who my top 5 are. I'm ready for the backlash now. That's fine. Like I can deal with that part, but oh my gosh, I know Joey will not be surprised that I was anxious about this one. So.
No, not at all. But I mean, people were starting to make me nervous, commenting immediately after posting and texts and just like, hey, it's a tough one. Are you guys up to it? I think we did it. I think we did it justice. I think we covered it well. And if not, let us know. Leave us a comment and we'll read them the next time for sure. That'll be fun. All right. For Paul, Jamie, Justin, I'm Joe Mays. This was the Bulldog Hour. And until next time, remember,
go Bulldogs.
Go Bulldogs.
Want more Wilson football? Follow the show on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and SoundCloud. Or visit www.bulldoghour.com. The Bulldog Hour is a featured program on jmnjrradio.com.